So let me ask you a question. Can a man become God? Let me ask you another question. Can God become a man?
No to the first, second, yes.
These are rhetorical questions. Questions of record. In other words, for the sake of. And then the other question that really needs to be answered, is Yeshua God? Is he both the Father and the Son? Now these questions have been around for 2,000 years, really, a long time. And in the letter that Rav Shaul is writing to the Philippians, in chapter 2, he includes a piece that's called the Messianic Hymn. That's not in the text, but scholars over the years have called it, this section, the Messianic Hymn. So right now I'm going to get us back on track by showing us the maps. Can we have the maps up there? I want to show you where we are, in case you've forgotten. I can't see this far. Okay. Here's Israel over here. And Paul's been working up in this area a lot. And then he goes over to this area, Macedonia. And ultimately he's planning to go all the way to Spain. But right now he's in a Roman prison. He wants to go back to his friends in Philippi. But right now he's here in prison. And that's why he's writing this letter, one of the so-called prison letters or prison epistles. So let me just quickly review for us. In chapter 1, we read about Paul's continual caring for his Philippian friends. He expresses it with great love and how blessed he was that they worked with him to spread the good news to people. He let them know how he's been arrested and put in chains. In other words, he's in jail. He lets them know also that he prays for them with a sincere heart. And he says that your love may more and more overflow in fullness of knowledge and depth of discernment, so that they would be able to determine what is best and thus be pure and without blame for what's called the day of the Messiah, or the day of the Lord, or the judgment day. So he's praying for these friends that he has. Remember, he's in prison. Yet he's not praying for himself, he's praying for his friends. He's teaching us something by doing that. He was pleased to tell them that he was in chains, because, as I shared last week, the week before, when the good news was preached, because he was in chains, it went further than it would have gone without that. He also reminds them last week that there was a secret way the gospel was spread, and that was through jealousy. Jealousy and contention sometimes cause the gospel to spread. Because God's going to cause his message to go forth in the midst of whatever is happening. So even though you may not feel your life is exactly where it should be, and none of us really are, we are still called to be messengers of the new covenant. We are still called, whether we are in wonderful spiritual condition or lousy spiritual condition, we're called to express God's good news. He shared last week about a conflict that he was having. On the one hand, he wanted to die so he could be with Yeshua permanently. On the other hand, he loved these people that he was serving, the Philippians, and he thought he ought to stick around and work with them and teach them how to have better lives and serve the Lord even better. So he was conflicted, and as we know from reading last week, he decided that he would stick around and care for the brethren in Philippi. So he concluded the chapter saying this, that he wanted them to conduct their lives in a way worthy of the good news of the Messiah, standing firm, united in spirit, fighting with one accord for the faith of the good news, not frightened by anything the opposition does. So he decided, I'm going to stick around, and this is what I hope will happen to the Philippians. You see, a key word in all this, unity. Unity, and that's the key sub-theme, or perhaps the main theme of the letter to the Philippians. So in chapter 2, Paul begins to give us some powerful and poetic affirmation of the eternal divine nature of Yeshua as his place as one with the God of Israel. Now here, I want to suggest something to you. I don't think Paul was writing a theology doctrinal statement here. I don't think he was talking about the divinity of the Messiah. I think he was using the example of Yeshua's sacrificial ways and humility to teach his Philippian friends how to get along in their community. But in this, he gives a great explanation of who Yeshua really is and how important it is to understand this. By the 4th century of the Common Era, that's 325 actually, there was a council in Nicaea. They call it, guess what? The Nicene Council. And they started to come up with some other ways to look at Yeshua's identity, not as God incarnate, but as maybe some fiction that became God, or something, an understanding that he was God even though maybe he wasn't God. But here, Paul presents in this Messianic hymn, Philippians 2, 5 through 11, that Yeshua is the divine Messiah and the one God of Israel becoming human being. So this Messianic hymn clearly shows that Paul, at least in his understanding, and the earliest Messianic community affirmed what's called the High Christology, almost 300 years before the Council of Nicaea. High Christology means a recognition that Yeshua was not just a human being, but he was God incarnate. Through this Christological teaching in the Messianic hymn, though the Christological teaching of the Messianic hymn usually focuses on the writing and teaching from this chapter, in the wider scope of the letter, Paul is primarily focusing on teaching humility of the Messiah as an example to the Philippians. It wasn't that he wrote this letter to teach about the divine Yeshua. He was trying to teach his Philippian friends that if they're going to have a successful congregation, they need to learn humility. And his example was Yeshua's divine nature emptying himself of his godness, shall we say, to become a human being, becoming a man, just like the rest of us. And he thinks that this is an important message to give to the Philippians. In this chapter, Paul presents the greatest example of humility known to man, Messiah Yeshua. And he follows this by further examples. So let me begin chapter 2. Therefore, if you have any encouragement for me from your being in union with the Messiah, any comfort flowing from love, any fellowship with me in the Spirit, or any compassion or sympathy, then, he says, complete my joy, or make my joy complete, by having a common purpose and a common love, by being one in heart and mind. Again, the theme is unity. Unity. Do nothing out of rivalry or vanity, but in humility regard each other as better than yourselves. Paul encourages the Philippians to identify with the model presented by Yeshua's life and his character qualities, and which will naturally stem from the Philippians being in union with Yeshua and will reflect Yeshua's humility. So one of the major themes of this letter, as I said before, is humility. In fact, I would say that the Philippian letter is a letter about humility. What is humility? Let me read an example of humility in some of the rabbinic writings that I think is a good way to get a look at this. According to the rabbis, greatness and humility in Jewish tradition are not incompatible. Greatness and humility are not incompatible. They complement one another. For a man to be humble, he does not have to be someone who has plenty to be humble about, as Churchill is reported to have said, of a political opponent who was praised for his humility. The greater the man, the more humble he is expected to be and is likely to be. The Torah says the rabbis, this is a comment about humility and how the Torah relates to it. The rabbis say in the Torah, it's compared to water, for just as water only runs downhill, never uphill. The word of God can only be heard in a humble heart. The Jewish moralists are fully aware that any conscious attempt to attain to humility is always self-defeating, and that pride can masquerade as humility as well. Crude vanity and self-glorification are easily recognized for what they are. Mock modesty is less easy to detect. It is not unusual for a man to take pride in his humility, nor is it unknown for a man to indulge in the more subtle forms of self-deception in which he prides himself that he is not a victim of false modesty. In other words, you can't work to be humble, and then you can't go telling people how humble you are. Remember last week we talked about Moses' humility, and he wrote, or what was written about him at the end of his life in Deuteronomy, that he was the most humble man on the face of the earth. And I really value the way Rabbi Foreman explained that. The reason he was so humble was because he was observant. He did what the Lord called him to do. And in doing so, that reflected humility. So for us to learn to be more humble, we can't just say, I'm going to be humble today, right? But as we do what God calls us to do, whatever that might be, we find that humility starts to develop. So here he's talking about the Philippians. They should identify with the model of Yeshua's humility, and that will change their ways. Now, as we look into this Messianic hymn, we're going to see a few things of interest. We'll see the purpose of the point of the unified heart and mind reflecting Yeshua's humble servanthood and self-sacrifice. Unity comes from humility. If you want to have unity with somebody, a husband and a wife, a congregation and members of the congregation, friends, if you want to have unity, the key word is develop humility, servant-like, self-sacrificial ways. So he says, look out for each other's interests and not just for your own. See, that's a way to develop humility. Think about what matters to somebody else before you think about yourself. This is a teaching to develop humility. So Paul is seeing this in the Messianic hymn. So he requests that the Philippians seek the best for other people and not just for themselves, just as he himself continues demonstrating the self-sacrificing love and humble service of the Messiah. To be like the Messiah is to be other-centered. I'll repeat that. To be like the Messiah is to be other-centered, not self-centered. And have the mindset of Yochanan the Immerser, who, speaking about Yeshua, declared, he must become more important while I become less important. So Yochanan the Immerser, John the Baptist, understood as important as his role was, it was him to be diminished to elevate the Messiah. That is a picture of humility, my friends. So he goes on in the Messianic hymn, starting with verse 5. Let your attitude toward one another be governed by your being in union with the Messiah Yeshua. And here's where we get into the Christology. Though he was in the form of God, he did not regard equality with God something to be possessed by force. On the contrary, he emptied himself in that he took the form of a slave by becoming like human beings are, and when he appeared as a human being, he humbled himself still more by becoming obedient even unto death, death on the stake as a criminal. Therefore God raised him to the highest place and gave him a name above all names, that in honor of the name given Yeshua, every knee will bow in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and every tongue will confess or acknowledge that Yeshua the Messiah is Adonai, to the glory of God the Father. That's what they are calling the Messianic hymn. It tells about the coming of the Messiah into the world as a slave, a servant, and then his death on a Roman execution stake, and then his exaltation to being Lord of all creation. Now, many scholars, you might find this interesting, think that Paul was actually quoting from a previously written hymn or liturgical prayer that the people of Philippi were familiar with and may have been even saying, to emphasize Yeshua's perfect humility. that Paul was calling them to pursue. One man said that these verses could be understood as an early Messianic Jewish hymn. In other words, that the Messianic Jews, when they got together, sang a song like we sing songs, and the lyrics in the song were these words in this hymn, that this scholar thinks that Paul basically copied into this letter. Now, in those days, you may know this, hymns were sung to the gods, to the gods of the Greek religious festivals. There were songs written about Zeus and about all the other gods of Greek theology or mythology. And so new followers of Yeshua would have been fairly familiar with this approach to worship. In other words, to sing a song of praise to the one they worship was a common practice in these days. The use of hymns and psalms in temple or synagogue worship was also something very familiar to the Jewish people of that day and those Jewish Philippians that were there. And one man suggested that the hymn originated from an earlier Aramaic liturgical prayer. Aramaic, for those of you who don't know, was a language very much like Hebrew and also very popular in that day. It uses a lot of Hebrew characters, but it was a slightly different language. And there were a lot of things written in Aramaic, like liturgical prayer, to avoid writing in the holy language, Hebrew. So it's kind of a way to get around using the holy language of Hebrew. In fact, to this day, Orthodox Jews are very sensitive about using the Hebrew holy language in casual ways. So this writer says certain style differences from Paul's writing make scholars think it was actually an Aramaic hymn that Paul brought into this letter. Another person said, no, I don't think so. A man named Gordon Feast said he understood the hymn to be Pauline in origin, meaning that Paul actually wrote this hymn himself. In fact, he said, it is a thoroughly Pauline sentence, with Pauline, meaning Paulish, or idioms from Paul, Pauline use of the Septuagint, Pauline theology, and the basic Pauline confession that the Lord is none other than Yeshua HaMashiach. Another man understood this Messianic hymn to represent a poetic flow from verses 1 to 4 that leads into the hymn based on the shared language and theology. So those that hold to a pre-Pauline tradition, meaning that the song came from before Paul actually wrote it, but was used by Paul, become functionally Pauline once they were used. In other words, they may have taken the hymn from somewhere else. Paul may have taken the hymn from somewhere else. But once he incorporated it in the letter to the Philippians, it became part of his theology. Now, you know, we have prayers in the Siddur, right? We read from the Siddur. Carrie often mentions that the Amida is the oldest Jewish prayer, right? Well, the Siddur prayers all express theological concepts and the development of theology in the Jewish world. So this liturgical hymn gives us an early look at the Messianic Jewish theology of the first century. And it was a growing theology that developed among the Jewish people and the Gentile people that were joining themselves to the movement. The construction of liturgical prayers and hymns like this one took passages from, say, Isaiah 45:23, which is a passage from the Tanakh that applied to the one God of Israel, and he referred it to Yeshua, showing an early understanding of the divine nature of Yeshua by the earliest of Yeshua followers. So I'm answering the question I asked, is Yeshua God? Is Yeshua God? Well, Paul, by choosing some verses from the Tanakh, particularly from the prophet Isaiah, seemed to think so, because he ties some verses from Isaiah the prophet in with a reference to Yeshua. So we can see this liturgical development in an early theological understanding of the first century Messianic Jews, that the nature of the God of Israel is more complicated than strict monotheism. Okay, the reason I mention that is there's always a debate that the Jewish people say, well, Christians worship three gods. You've heard that. And Jewish people say we worship one God. But the truth is, that one God, historically, seemed to have several aspects to him. Now, I don't believe that God is more than one. God is one. The Shema tells us God is one. But there seems to be some aspect of a multiple nature to God. The Shema itself says, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one." And the Hebrew word used for one there doesn't mean the absolute number one. That would be Yahid. It uses the word Echad, which is a plural form of one. So when the spies went to the promised land, as we just read about, and they came back with a bushel of a bunch of grapes, remember that? They found these wonderful grapes. It says they came back with one bushel, or one tree, whatever it is. And the word there is Echad. The one was a composite unity. So we have to remember that the Torah itself allows for God's nature, the one true God, to have a composite unity. And the Nicene Creed said that God was one, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Now, to me, and that's the Trinitarian point of view. I don't have a problem with that. I just have a problem with dividing it up like there's God over here, and God over there, because God is one. A composite unity. It's impossible for us human beings to get this, but we have to trust it in faith that that's the way it is. This is being reflected here in this Messianic hymn. In Yeshua, the divine nature is shared, and yet it is within the framework of the one true God. Though 2,000 years of theologians have been wrestling with the place of Yeshua, as well as the Ruach HaKodesh, within the one God of Israel expressed in the Shema, it appears that the earliest Yeshua followers accepted that the God of Israel became a human being in Yeshua, in line with the liturgical use of the Psalms in which they worship. It's important for us to know that, because Jewish people say to us that we don't worship one God because we believe Yeshua in some way is God, the Son of God, the divine incarnate God in human form. It's a new idea that the Christians came up with. It's an ancient Jewish concept, as we see here and in other places. So the quoting of the Psalms in different places and their worship follows liturgical songs that honor Yeshua as the Lord. Some of the Psalms seem to point to that as well. So in addition to containing one of the most potent and straightforward teachings of the eternal divine nature of Yeshua, this Messianic hymn teaches the Philippians essential lessons of humility modeled on the Messiah's humility and servanthood. That's the point of it. This is not a theological doctrinal letter. It's a letter to encourage the Philippians to learn to develop more humility. And the ultimate example of the most essentially humble person in the world is Yeshua, the Messiah. Am I right? Such servanthood and self-sacrifice offered a way for the Philippians to model the kind of unity Paul laid out in the first 4 verses of the chapter. And let's continue to look. He says to them, "Let your attitude toward one another be governed by your union with the Messiah Yeshua." See, Paul here is calling the Philippians to take on a communal attitude of unity that reflected being in unity with the Messiah Yeshua. Verse 6, though he was in the form of God, he did not regard equality with God something to be possessed by force. In this verse, we see Paul beginning his teaching on Yeshua's emergence into the world as a humble servant, the highest example of humility that Paul addresses in this letter. In speaking of Yeshua as he came in the form of God, some scholars have noted that there's a parallel between Yeshua and Adam. Adam, it says, was created in the image of God, right? But it says Yeshua came as the eternally divine God into our humble world. A related passage. So Yeshua's pre-incarnation status was and remained divine in the form of God. As fully divine, Yeshua became a man in contrast to us being just a human being in the image of God on a divine mission. See, many Jewish people today say, oh, Yeshua was a wonderful rabbi, a wonderful teacher. And he was. But he also claimed to be God incarnate. And that's where a lot of Jewish people draw the line. They say that's polytheism, multi-God. And we can't do that. We've been punished too strictly over the years for believing in many gods. So it's important for us as Messianic Jews to understand from this letter to the Philippians that there's nothing in it that indicates that Yeshua was not really God incarnate. He wasn't just a human being that had a spiritual nature. He was God in the flesh. And he took on the form of a servant, the greatest example of humility, going from the height of being God's son to God's servant, God's slave. He assumed the lowest form of humanity in those days and ultimately was a slave, a servant, executed in the worst possible way on a Roman execution stake. And that was the most painful way for a person to die. But he was willing to do this because he was a humble man fulfilling his calling. Isn't there a lesson in that? Paul wanted the Philippians to get this idea that looking at the way Yeshua lived and died is a message for how we are to behave ourselves. That is, with humility. I think of Moses sometimes. He left the position of number 2 in all of Egypt. He was the number 2 most powerful man in Egypt, and he left that all. He left that whole position to serve our people in the wilderness for 40 years. He prefigured what happened with Yeshua. So in verse 6, Paul speaks plainly and without explanation about the pre-existence of Yeshua in line with established Jewish thought about the pre-existence of the Messiah. This is not a new thing. The fact that Yeshua admitted to being God incarnate, and Paul references him as God incarnate, was not anti-Jewish. It was consistent with Jewish theology of that day. A lot of people don't know that, but it's important for you and me to know that and to present that to our people when they say that. There are many other examples I can quote here, but I don't have time to go into too much of this. But there were Jewish traditions that related to Enoch, demonstrating the belief in the divine messianic figure was understood as part of Jewish understanding and expectation. So the eternal divine nature of Yeshua that he bore even before his birth into this world is one that we do not have to shy away from. We have to affirm. Daniel Boyarin, who's an eminent Orthodox Jewish scholar, argues that, he said, I submit that it is possible to understand the gospel only if both Yeshua and the Jews around him held to a high Christology, whereby the claim of messiahship was also a claim to being a divine man. Boyarin says, were it not the case, we would be very hard-pressed to understand the extremely hostile reaction to Jesus on the part of Jewish leaders who do not accept his claim. So he says, how do you explain all this, the antipathy, hostility from the Jewish leaders toward this wonderful rabbi? Because he claimed to be divine. He claimed to be God. And Boyarin nails it. He says that hostility came because he said to do that. Whether he was or not, at this point, is not the question. He claimed to be, and many followed him as God incarnate. So, in verse 7 it says, on the contrary, he emptied himself and that he took on the form of a slave by becoming like human beings are, and when he appeared as a human being. The Greek word here that he emptied himself, you might want to write this down, is called, it's kenosis. Kenosis means to empty yourself. Many scholars understand that Yeshua in his incarnation emptied himself of omnipotence, omnipresence, and omniscience of God. Emptying could signify the sinless Savior's sacrificial death, where he poured out his life and bore the sins of many. he gave up everything. He gave up all of his rights to be Lord of the universe so he could be with us, showing us the way and ultimately dying on our behalf. So the word to empty yourself is kenosis. You might want to make a note of that. That's a Greek word. And he took on the form of a servant. That was something to teach the Philippian people, because he was trying to get them to understand the idea of humility. In Isaiah 52:13, the beginning of the servant songs, which includes Isaiah 53, that famous chapter, we see the use of the Hebrew word eved, E-V-E-D, rendered as slave or servant in English. The Greek word that was used in the Septuagint is a Greek translation of the Tanakh, the Old Testament. The Greek word that was used in Isaiah 52:13 there was doulos, which means also slave. So it was clear that Isaiah 52 and Isaiah 53 speak of a person who would be a servant of all, or a slave of all, ultimately be willing to die for the sins of mankind. Yeshua is the fulfillment of Isaiah's servant songs, of which Isaiah 53 is the best known. And it says he became like human beings. He became born like a human being. He didn't just become a human being. He was born as a human being, so he could take on identification with us and ultimately be willing to die in our place. Yeshua's divinity is not something totally different from his humanity. His divinity is the transcendent depth of his humanity. Yeshua was immeasurably more human than other human beings. So becoming a man was not a sign that Yeshua was inferior to the Father, because his innate divine status, though humbled in the incarnation, demonstrated the obedience of the Messiah as voluntary, joyful, thankful obedience as a son. Remember, he was emulating the ways of God to show us the ways of God, and ultimately the ways is sacrificial, and that's what leads to humility. So in the Messianic Hymn, we see the dual nature of Yeshua that begins in his divine state and then humbly enters the world as a slave that would die on the Roman execution stake to provide salvation for each one of us. The writer to the Hebrews, the Messianic Jews of the first century, wrote these words. But when the Messiah appeared as Kohen Gadol, high priest of the good things that are happening already then, through the greater and more perfect tent in which is not man-made, he entered not by the means of blood of goats and calves, but by means of his own blood, thus setting people free forever. For he offered himself to God as a sacrifice without blemish, and he'll purify our conscience from works that lead to death, so that we can serve the living God. The unique priestly role of Yeshua the Messiah is unique because he was the priest and he was also the sacrifice. That reflects the concept in Judaism of two Messiahs. One Messiah who would reign as king, Messiah ben David, and one Messiah who would die and suffer, Messiah ben Yosef. So there is a clear teaching in the Jewish writings that there had to be two Messiahs because of the descriptions of the Messiahs in the Tanakh. One description of the Messiah is that he's going to reign as king. The other description is going to suffer and die. How do you reconcile that? Well, we reconcile it by recognizing that Yeshua did suffer and die, but he rose from the dead through the power of God, and he is now reigning as king. So we see not two separate Messiahs, but one Messiah coming and fulfilling two purposes of the divine Messiah. So Paul is making the Philippians aware of the cost of obedience in modeling Yeshua. The cost means the cost of discipleship, as Bonhoeffer said. Following Messiah might lead us to the execution stake if we're going to be truly disciples of the Messiah. I hope that doesn't happen to me. I hope it doesn't happen to you. But we have to be aware. The one whom we follow most committedly already showed us the way. That's the greatest act of humility, The Messiah's death is to point to the unity for the followers of Yeshua. So it was this act of supreme humility that formed the basis from which Yeshua demonstrated his worthiness to exaltation to the highest place. This exaltation represents the highest place of authority, which reflects Daniel's prophecy of the end days in Daniel 7, 13, and 14, where the Son of Man, Yeshua in this case, is granted eternal, universal rulership by the Ancient of Days, God the Father. So let me ask you a question. This is all heavy theology, high theology, and we sort of trust it because we're believers. We trust that Yeshua is God incarnate, even though I got to tell you, it's hard for me to imagine looking at any one human being like Carrie or Steve or Tim or anybody, and you telling me you're God. I know you wouldn't because it's blasphemy, but supposing you really were God. If a human being like Yeshua claimed to be God, you can imagine how crazy that might have sounded to the people of his day, and how bothersome it would have sounded to the religious leaders who did not want to see their people suffer again from idolatry. The fact is, though, whether he is God or not, and I believe Yeshua was God, we need to recognize that in the end of days, every knee will bow to him, every knee. I think the believers will bow in honor, and those who are unbelievers will bow in judgment. But what do we do with that information? We learn that in his life and death, we are to recognize true humility. That's what Paul was trying to get across to the Philippians, that they needed to learn how to be sacrificial, self-sacrificing, like Yeshua was, who gave his life to die on an execution stake for you and for me. So verse 11 says, Yeshua the Messiah is Adonai, the Lord. It's a prophetic word in that. He's the Lord. And because of that, when we serve him, when we serve one another, we're fulfilling the purpose for which he came into this world. It wasn't just to die and pay for our sins. It was to show us what true humility is all about. So I pray that each one of us will take this to heart and think about our relationships, either congregationally or family or whatever, and learn to model ourselves after the Messiah, who was truly humble. He gave up everything so that he could be a human being and make the sacrifice for each one of us. He gave up everything. What are we willing to give up? Ultimately, we can give up our lives, we can say that, but that's unlikely to be our calling. Yet some of us have to give up our pride. Some of us have to give up our anger. Some of us have to give up our fear. Some of us have to give up the attitudes that separate us from God's love. It's a sacrifice, but that's what we're called to do because Yeshua showed us the way. And next week we're going to pick up more on this in Philippians chapter 2 from 12 on. I call it Paul's call to living the new life in the Messiah. So now that we've understood our calling to be servants and humble, to develop unity, we're going to learn more about how to have a new life in the Messiah Yeshua, in whose name we give this message.